The marsh had a way of holding a man's breath and giving it back to him colder. The stones underfoot were slick with lichen the color of old bruises, and water lay on either side like sleep that could drown you if you turned the wrong way. Ghost took to it as if he had always known such country, stepping from slab to slab without looking down, pausing to taste the wind where it came thin and iron-sour off miles of peat. Arya counted under her breath, 1 to 20 and 20 to 1, because Syrio had told her to count when the ground moved and she must not. They saw a lizard lion once, or it saw them and let itself be seen. A long, low thing with a mouth full of nails and eyes like the beads on an old woman's neck. It lay among reeds and did not move, and then it moved as if the whole marsh had shrugged and slid away. Arya sucked in air through her teeth. "I could spear it," she whispered, as if the wish might make itself a weapon. "You could not," Yoren said. "Even if you did, it would not stay speared. Let every creature keep to its place when the earth is poor." Once, when the causeway dipped and the stone felt like it might decide to be water, a voice came up from the reeds to their right, quiet and close and older than its speaker. "Turn your foot a hand to the north, wolves," it said. "There's a gap there where the frogs know to go. The stone breaks where your next step is." Yoren did not start. He nodded in the way men nod when they have long been speaking with voices they cannot put a face to. "My thanks," he said. Arya's eyes went huge and hunting at once, scanning the reeds, finding nothing, finding everything. A man rose from the water at the edge of the causeway as if the marsh had made him and were sorry to be rid of him. He was small, but the water slung from his shoulders in ropes, and his frog spear had 3 barbed teeth that looked like they had been broken out of a deer skull. He wore mud as if it were silk and had a net slung over one shoulder with the casual ease of a man who knows the strains of it like he knows the ache in his own knees. "Stark smells strong," he observed, as neutrally as one might speak of the weather. He looked at Ghost last and longest and did not flinch. "And Wolf," Yoren scratched his cheek. "Aye, the wolf goes with the boy. The boy goes with me until I'm tired of him. The girl is a rat." The Cranagman's mouth tilted, which might have been laughter if such a thing could be heard in the neck. "There is reed in the water," he said as if to himself. "We keep the causeways when men forget to pay them mind." He jerked his chin to the left. "Come on then, Longshanks. Your feet are too big for these stones. I'll show you where to put them so the marsh doesn't take its tithe." He went ahead, not on the causeway but beside it, in water no higher than his shins. He seemed never to disturb the surface. Jon followed the line of his movement with his eyes and learned something about how to step even when he would never move like that. "Howland Reed," he said before he could stop himself, and felt foolish as soon as the name left him. This man was not old enough by 20 years to be the man his father had spoken of not at all. The man who had been with him in a place of reeds and blood that Eddard Stark never gave words to. Still, the name leapt up because the neck kept it, perhaps. The Cranagman looked back and his eyes were the color of wet bark. "You know names that the South forgets," he said, not displeased. "There are reeds enough that the water will always say reed. Names go down and come up the way fish do." Arya edged close until her shoulder brushed Jon's arm. "Do you have a daughter?" she blurted. "Does she climb? There's a boy in the South with stubborn fists who will be king one day, and I think he ought to meet a girl with a spear." The Cranagman's mouth tilted again. "We have daughters," he said, "and sons. They do not go south when the South is shouting. They wait until the shouting stops and then they go to see who is left to listen to." He glanced at Jon. "You take this one north. Don't let the marsh teach her all its tricks. Some tricks shouldn't be learned if you want to live well." "We'll live," Jon said. The words weren't a promise. They were a piece of iron he held in his mouth until his tongue knew the taste. They slept that night on a handful of stones that made a higher handful and kept their backs out of the soak. The Cranagman slid away at dusk without farewell because goodbyes sink in this country and rot. He left behind a bundle of something wrapped in rushes. Yoren opened it with the wariness of a man who has found more than one adverse gift in his time and took out strips of smoked meat so dark they were nearly black and cakes of something flat and green as pondweed. "Bog bread," he said, chewing. "It'll keep you standing if not happy." Arya took a bite and scowled, and then took another because she would not give the neck the satisfaction of making her spit. By morning the world was wider, and the air had learned to move again without sounding like a held breath. The causeway found land without announcing it, and they stepped down onto it with the small surprise one feels when a long pain ceases and for a moment you can't recall what else there is. The hills rolled up like old knuckles, and pines gathered in little families and higher up in ranks. Jon sniffed and smelled the cold smell of the north that even summer can't make soft. Ghost lifted his head and sang once, and it was not for warning but for the rightness of a thing remembered. There are places where the old lives nearer the skin than other places. They passed barrows that held kings whose names are not written anywhere men can read. Arya ran her fingers over one as they went by and shivered as if the earth had breathed on her hand. Yoren doffed his cap without strictly meaning to. Jon felt something under his boots answer him, and he did not have words for it and did not seek them. The wind said what he needed said. They took the King's Road where it lifted out of the trees and went like a thought toward Winterfell. Tracks lay there, oxen, carts, a litter once, 1,000 hoofprints layered so that the oldest looked new because the shapes of hooves do not change when kings do. The farther north they went, the more the road felt like a thing that had been made long ago and was being kept by men whose fathers had kept it and their fathers before, not for lords or wars but because a road is a promise you make to your neighbor and keep to yourself. Yoren went with them as if he had never meant to go another way. At a fall of ground where long grass lay like sleeping wolves, he turned to Jon and grunted. "You came south to be a shadow and fetched yourself a piece of the sunlight instead," he observed, not exactly approving and not exactly disapproving. "There was a time I'd have told you to keep going north past the big house until the world ended and to stay there. Now I think the big house is where you're likeliest to do the good a boy can do." "I'll take my sister there," Jon said. After that, Yoren said, as if the words were a pebble in his boot and he were too stubborn to stop and shake it out. "You'll come to the wall when your work in the south of the north is done. Or you won't. The wall will still be where it is and the night behind it, and men will be dying under it whether you're among them or not." He squinted at Jon. "Your wolf will not like it there. He will like that you like it less. That's the way of wolves." Winterfell announced itself first with the smell of wood smoke and horses and steaming straw, a smell that could be worn like a scarf. The trees grew a certain way on the approach, the old oaks leaning and twining as if they had grown up watching a thing that required them to show it respect. The curtain wall rose out of the hill rather than being set upon it. The towers made old shapes against the sky that could remember Snow's men in King's Landing think are stories. The guards on the gatehouse peered down, saw Yoren's black, saw the white wolf that was no dog, saw the boy whose face had two men's ghosts in it if you had the eyes for ghosts. The horn sounded once, the note folding into the stone. A boy ran. Another boy threw down the rope for the bell and then decided he didn't need to ring it again because the first note had told the castle all it could have needed to hear. Robb came to the yard half-armored, breath heaving as if he'd run from sword yard to gatehouse without remembering to breathe on the way. He had grown another measure of a man since Jon had ridden away. His face had lost some of the soft that even stark boys keep until something carves it off. He saw Arya first and then he saw Jon, and his mouth opened and closed like a fish that did not know whether to leap or drown. "Robb," Jon said, and then Arya was out of breath and out of sense and in Robb's arms, both of them laughing and making little noises like hurt and relief at once. Ghost pushed his head under Robb's hand as if to say, "Yes, you still belong to me." Yoren stood aside and looked like a man who would not admit he had anything to do with this. Catelyn Stark came to them with her mouth a thin line and two bright spots high on her cheeks, the places where heat collects when a woman has been refusing to weep for too long. She would not run, because a lady does not run in her own yard, not for messenger nor for king. She walked, and her feet were steady and her hands were not. She took Arya's face between those hands and looked and would not blink because blinking is like turning away. "You," she said, "you are whole." Her throat moved. "Thank the gods." Arya turned that fierce little smile of hers on her mother, and for a heartbeat she was the small child who had climbed into Catelyn's lap unasked and unrepentant. Then the moment passed, and she was the girl who had chased a copper-eyed cat along a wall in a city where men counted smiles as coin. "Sirio taught me to move," she said, as if that were explanation and absolution. Catelyn's eyes slid past Arya then, because there was another face that had to be looked at. Jon stood where he had always stood in this place, a half step inside and a step behind, his hands at his sides, his mouth without a smile, his eyes careful. "My lady," he said. She took in the wolf at his heel and the cut on his sleeve and the set of his arm, as if his arm had learned to set itself a different way since she had seen him last. Her mouth did not soften. "You brought my daughter to me," she said. "I did," Jon said. "He did not say I did because your husband told me to. He did not say I did because there was nowhere else to bring her. He did not say I did because I am what I am and could not unknow it even if I wanted to. He said I did and held it." Catelyn inclined her head. The gesture was what she would have given a sworn man who had done his duty. It was more than she had ever given him before. Or perhaps it only felt that way because the day was made of iron. "Thank you," she said. And the words cost her something and bought something as well. Maester Luwin came bustling with 2 pages and a kitten and a list in his head and worry in his eyes. "Yoren," he said, surprised into warmth. "I meant you a month from now and with fewer wolves." "Lost time," Yoren said. "Found wolves. I'll be gone again when I've watered my men and insulted your beer. I've stolen 2 of your lord's children and brought 1 back, so we're even. The other I'll turn loose at your gate, and you can chase him with a broom if it pleases you. He's a rat." "Leave him," Catelyn said automatically, then grimaced at herself for having spoken a thing unworthy of her mouth. "Leave him. He's eaten enough fear to last him till winter." She pressed fingers into her temple as if feeling for something that had slipped under the skin and needed to be caught. Come inside. You must tell me everything you cannot tell me and everything you would rather not." The hall was warmer than Jon had remembered because the north had begun to lean toward its longer nights and the fires had learned to sit like red beasts and not move. Bran's chair had been remade. Jon saw it as soon as he crossed the threshold, against the wall near the dais, its wheels stout and its back high, the leather cushioned where a boy's bony shoulder blades would chafe. He felt a small relief he had never admitted to himself sink its teeth into his heart and let go again, because relief is an animal that cannot be kept. Bran came in after them on the little cart Hodder pulled, cheekbones sharper than before and eyes larger and better at looking. He wore his hair long over his ears and his mouth went a certain way when he tried not to show he was tired. When he saw Jon, he tried not to smile and failed. "You look like a crow," he told him, which from Bran was a kindness. And then, softer, "You came back. For a time," Jon said, his throat tightening. He knelt beside the chair and felt the wood under his hand for a moment and then put his forehead against Bran's knuckles as if they were the heart tree's root. "You look like the brother I always had." "I fell," Bran said, solemn as a maester reading a date. "I think I flew. That's what I remember when I sleep." He glanced over Jon's shoulder and saw Ghost and brightened the way boys brighten for wolves and fathers. "He's bigger. He grew," Jon said. "We both did." They were not granted the luxury of being only a family for long. Winterfell breathed deeply for a dozen heartbeats and then remembered it was a keep and a seat and a place that answered for more than itself. Ser Roderick Castle had a scar new risen along his jaw and his white whiskers were stubborn as his eyes. Theon Greyjoy lounged with the peculiar carelessness of a boy who keeps trying on men's shapes in front of a mirror. Galbart Glover stood like a man ready to push a door down with his shoulder and would wait all day if it made the door open better. They wore worry as if it were only one more piece of clothing and they had grown used to its weight. "A raven from the south," Ser Roderick told Robb and Catelyn, "because titles bend around blood when fear comes. From King's Landing. From a little hand with too much rings on it." He frowned. "It bears the Queen's seal and the hands, both. It bears also the smell of lies." Catelyn took the strip of parchment as if it might bite. Theon leant as if to read over her shoulder because he had never learned that leaves break if you lean too hard. Robb caught him a look that said not now, and Theon grinned and did not mind. Catelyn read and scowled and read again, and then held the parchment out to Luwin as if it might burn worse if she kept it. It was Sansa's hand on the lines, neat and careful and trained to please. Jon saw it from where he stood and had to look away. The words begged Robb to come to King's Landing and lay down his swords and bring Winterfell's strength to Joffrey. King by right of... Catelyn's mouth tightened. By right of what a boy in silk says is his right when a woman in green tells him what rights are. The letters spoke of treason. They spoke of mercy. She believes it, Robb said. He had read with his lips pressed together without moving. He looked angry and he looked like a boy. The two looks sat poorly together and made a third thing in his face. She believes we... She believes father. She believes what she must to keep her head, Catelyn said. Her voice had the flatness of a line chipped into stone. The queen will have told her that if she writes thus, she will be safe. A child will believe that a snake will not bite if you tell it is a rope. She lowered herself into a chair as if her knees had ceased to be her own. We will not go to King's Landing one at a time, so the queen can count us as we pass her window. The Riverlands, Galbart Glover said grimly. Lord Tywin has sent his dogs. Gregor Clegane is burning around the Mummers Ford. Sir Adam Marbrand rides farther north than he has a right to ride. Riverrun may be taken before your banners are hoisted, my lady. Catelyn's hand had been smoothing the parchment into flatness it did not possess. She stopped. For a heartbeat, the woman who was only a mother stood up inside her, and would have gone any way a road allowed to be with the father of her children. Then the lady sat down again because there were more children than the two in King's Landing, and the country was a child of sorts. We will not let Riverrun fall, she said, to men whose fathers had sworn to Tully before Stark and would again. We will not let Winterfell be left with only women and boys as meat for any raider who fancies a south ride. The banners, Robb said. His eyes were bright and his jaw set. Send for the banners. The ravens are already gone, Maester Luwin said. They left at dawn. The great Jon will come whether we send for him or not. He does not like to think the world moves without him. Lady Mormont has answered already. She says the men of Bear Island are all the bears she can spare. They will come by boat to White Harbor and then by road. They will bite better than they look. Robb turned to Jon with a half-laugh that had no room in it for laughter. You return and I put you to work. Will you ride out to the Bar Rolands and the Hornwood with Grey Wind and see who is answering us and who needs reminding what their oaths cost to keep? You mean for me to scout, Jon said. He kept his voice even. You mean for me to go out and come back with what I see and not with a banner or a fight where none is ready? Robb's mouth quirked. I mean for you to move like winter shadow and breathe like a man who is not afraid of being cold. Catelyn's glance slid to Jon again and away. He will obey you? He will, Jon said, without looking at her. He is my lord in this. Something in Catelyn's face altered. It did not soften. Cracked. The crack was too small for any man to get a finger into it. It was big enough for air. You will bring your sister home, she said, as if reminding herself of an earlier exchange. And then you will help send my son south with all the caution and all the ferocity our house has learned to carry. It was acceptance the way a man accepts winter. It was less than Jon had ever wanted and more than he had expected. Yoren ate in the hall with his men and a portion of contempt for the way Northerners brewed their ale. He drank 3 cups and called it water and then went to sleep on his feet against a pillar for an hour without deciding to. Before dawn he found Jon on the wall walk with Ghost and the thin line of first light on the eastern trees. I leave you your girl and take my leave of you, he said. You did your work on this path. The next part is yours. The part after that is mine. He slapped Jon's shoulder once, the kind of wallop men give to wood to hear if it is sound. Keep your feet, boy. If the world tries to make you kneel, plant like a tree. And if the world sets me on a horse, sit it well, Yoren said, amused. But remember the ground is what keeps horses honest. They parted as men part who expect to meet again in a hard place if they meet at all. Yoren took the King's Road with his black cloaks and his thieves and his stubborn fools who would grow fewer and harder as the miles went on. Jon watched them go until the trees took them, and then until the sound of them was only an idea. The days that followed in Winterfell were days with bones in them. Men arrived and kept arriving. The horn at the gate learned 100 tones for 100 banners. The Umber men hooped as if the road had been a fight they'd won. The Karstarks came with quiet faces and hands that held their reins too tightly. From the Dreadfort came lean men with pale eyes who looked at the walls as if measuring them. They wore their obedience with the precision of stitched leather. The Mormonts sent women who laughed at the size of Winterfell and called it a babe's cradle, the way men from Bear Island will when they decide to love a thing and are ashamed to say so. Manderly's riders arrived last of the first wave, fat and shining like good dinners, and with the best stories. They spoke of ships in the harbor at White Knife Mouth and of a letter from the wall saying wildlings had begun to leave their fires to go northward, which was stranger than men going south. Robb stood in the great hall in his father's place, and the man grew up under the boy like a tree under a stake. The lords argued and then agreed and then argued about having agreed. Great Jon Umber roared and demanded the van and threatened to leave with his men and take the whole war under his arm like a barrel. Grey Wind then reminded the Great Jon that some oaths are written in scars as well as ink. And the Great Jon bled and laughed and bent his stubborn neck and afterward called Robb boy less and my lord more, and the world shifted by a hair and found a different balance. By night, Jon took Ghost out along the walls and into the Godswood and back. He stood under the heart tree with its red leaves whispering the way blood whispers in a man's ears when the night lasts too long. He put his hand to the pale bark and felt something in its cool that was not simply the cool of wood. Ghost lay like snow at the foot of the trunk and blinked slow as prayer. Jon spoke no high words and made no bargains. He said, "Keep him," and did not say whether he meant his father or his brother or all of them. When the ravens answered the ravens Winterfell had sent, they came heavy and fast, the way birds fly when they carry more than paper. Lord Serwyn would answer and bring 40 spears. Tallheart answered and said they needed 3 days to bring in the last of the harvest and could not leave their granaries to any man with a match. They would come with 200 when the last sack was stacked. By then word was in the hall about the Riverlands burning, confirmed by men who had run half their horses to death to bring it. Ser Edmure Tully was fighting the current of 2 rivers and one father and losing ground with both. Riverrun would fall and rise and fall like the breath of a dying thing if no one came. "We go by way of the Twins or we swim the Green Fork on wolves," Theon Greyjoy said, careless, as if rivers were women he had not yet decided whether to seduce or insult. "Walder Frey's brood will let us pass if we give them something to breed on. He likes to breed marriages. Let him breed honors for once." Catelyn's mouth went to a line again. "He will demand too much." "He will demand exactly as much as we can afford to give," Robb said. "He had his father's patience and his mother's accounting. We will give it, or we will break him. The first keeps us moving. The second throws us back into the river." Maester Luwin's raven cage filled and emptied and filled. The days flicked past with a mechanical precision that would have made Jon laugh if he had still been the boy who had laughed at stupid things. He rode out twice with Hullen to count men on the Barrow Road and taste which villages had fear that made them generous and which had fear that made them hide grain beneath their beds. He gave away Winterfell's coin where it would be remembered and withheld it where it would be stolen. He came back each night with Ghost muddy to the eyes and wrote numbers on scraps of parchment he could have told in his sleep. Arya found him where she always did, in a place he had not made himself and had not told her about. She had a capacity for happening to be where he was that would have irritated any man who had not loved her. She practiced what Syrio had taught her and what Jon had not, and the blend of the two made a girl who could walk past 3 men carrying buckets and never have a drop land on her boots. When he was summoned to the yard, she came and stood behind a pillar and watched and absorbed and would one day make use of what she had seen to someone's discomfort. "Take Grey Wind with you when you go south," she said to Robb the last night before the march, sneaking into Robb's chamber as if she had a claim to every room, which perhaps she did. "Make him bite anyone who calls you boy." "I would bite them myself," Robb said, trying for a laugh and finding a cough. He pulled her to him and held her fiercely as if trying to hold all the years he had to hold at once and put them in her bones. When he let her go, she did not cry. He did not either. The tears had been counted and spent earlier. There were none to throw at this exchange and little to be bought by them. Bran sat in his chair by the landing overlooking the yard when the banners finally went out. He had a fur over his legs that had warmed 3 Stark boys before him, and Summer lay at his feet with his head sideways as if the stones might yield a rabbit at any moment. Rickon stood with an apple in his fists and did not eat it. He held it the way a child holds a thing he does not wish to let any other child or wolf have. Shaggy Dog pressed his muzzle against Rickon's ribs and looked out with eyes too green to be kind. Catelyn stood with one hand on Bran's shoulder and the other around her own ribs, as if feeling whether they were still joined. Robb rode under the gate in mail that made him look older and in the surcoat with the direwolf that made him look exactly himself. The Great John roared and Lady Mormont nodded once like a woman approving a job begun at last. Roose Bolton's eye moved and did not move at all. The river of men that followed them down the hill was as long as a wrong story. The wind had changed overnight. It came at their backs now, pushing them toward the south as if the north had decided this had to be done quickly lest winter come wrong. Jon rode a little behind and to the right with gray wind slipping between horse and horse as if he were water, and Ghost at Jon's stirrup like a pale echo. He had a bag of numbers at his belt and a bag of words in his head. Catelyn's I found him once from the wall. She did not incline her head this time. She only looked. It was almost the same thing. He went with the van as far as the first keep and then turned aside and went north on a little loop with Hullen, as if a man might try to run from the work given him. He intended to meet them again at the Hunter's Gate below the low hill, by the stand of birches that had learned to say yes to the wind. On the way he cut by the edge of the godswood because he could not help it. The heart tree's red leaves flickered their slow truths. The face cut into the trunk looked older than it had a month ago. That may be trick of light. The pool held no ice yet but promised. Jon knelt without deciding to. Ghost's breath fogged and then was gone. For once in his life he did not form a sentence to speak to the tree. He did not form a thought. He let the place set him in whatever shape it needed. When he stood, he was ready to be a different man and also the same one, which is all a man ever gets when the world is honest with him. They moved quickly those first days because the army had the momentum of being new and a boy's pride pushed at its flanks. They slowed after because the river of men needs to be fed and the road needs to be mended as you use it. Robb learned how to make meat out of numbers and how to be kind at the same time. He learned when to shout and when to speak softly and when to lean and when to step back. He learned that the Great John did not require winning so much as he required seeing the boy's jaw set. He learned that Roose Bolton never required anything that could be seen. They found the burned places as they crossed into the Riverlands. Farmsteads like Black Teeth, orchards stripped, women with the particular silence of women who will not tell what was done because telling will make it real. They found a man hanging from a hawthorn with a parchment pinned to him that said treason in a hand that had learned to write as if cutting meat. They cut him down and buried him because the ground must not become used to holding such things. Jon looked at gray wind smelling the edges of the grave and thought a thought about vengeance that he did not allow to finish inside his mind. Word came of Riverrun. Besieged and desperate, but not fallen. Edmure Tully had been taken in some skirmish and sent to the west to be a prize at Casterly Rock. Or he had not, and fought like a trout at a hook and would yet throw it. Word came of the king's hand on a paper torn in the throne room and called a forgery by the queen's hand. Word came of Eddard Stark alive and then dead and then alive. The truth skittered like rain blown across a window. You could hear it without seeing it. At night by the watchfires men argued about which kings there were now that there had to be kings again. Some said 2 because you cannot break a thing in half without also making each half sharp. Some said 3 because a king had been made in the south while they weren't looking and another would be made in the west as soon as Tywin Lannister remembered that he had a son who could sit a chair if the chair were high enough. Jon said nothing. He kept his eyes on the flames and his hands on Ghost's neck and his mind on the only crown that mattered to him, which was a ring of stone walls and a red tree inside that made a sort of circle. By day he rode ahead and learned the smell of men moving in numbers. Ghost learned it faster and could tell him which campfires had burned out in fear and which had burned out because there was no more to put on them. When he came back to report to Robb, Robb would listen with his whole face and then take the bits that mattered and arrange them on the map with a finger, while Theon made jests and Roose Bolton made suggestions and the great Jon made threats everybody pretended were jokes. Jon watched his brother's hand and saw Eddard's hand there and thought, "The world is cruel and it is kind. We get both in the same measure if we live long enough." On a noon when the sky had managed a thin blue like ice in a rill, ravens found them with news that did not belong to the Riverlands. The Night's Watch had sent a bird to every lord with ink and time to read it. The bird said that rangers gone north were not come back. It said the dead were restless the way men's tongues are restless when they have been kept from drink. It said wildlings who had never agreed about anything were agreeing to leave the warm fires and go toward a colder one. It said a name men had forgotten how to say without smiling, others, and did not put a smile near it. Robb read it and went still. He looked older then for a full minute. Then he folded the scrap and gave it to Luwin. "We finish our work here first," he said quietly to Jon when they were standing between tents where the wind found them. "We have to. No one will turn a host around on one raven." "But the wall." "I know," Jon said. The knowing made a cold under his breastbone that the day's sun couldn't touch. "We have time to finish one thing so we can start the next. Or we do not. Either way, we finish this one and begin the other." Robb nodded once, small and fierce, and something passed between them that had not been there when Jon had ridden away to be a squire in a city that would not keep him whole. Something like the part of a vow you don't have to say out loud because saying it would make it less true. If the South had remembered that the North can move, the West had not. Tywin Lannister had his cords tied in a pattern that had taught the Riverlands to dance for him, but he did not yet count a boy's courage at proper weight. He sent men with Gregor's kind of laughter to burn more and call it strategy, and to leave messages on door lintels in blood to teach men to talk less about oaths and more about survival. He sent scouts across the Green Fork to count the trees and found wolves instead. He sent ravens to Walder Frey, who sent them back with demands all folded and perfumed and counted in grandchildren. Catelyn came to the camp by the twins with a speed that made men smile and then decide not to. She had set Winterfell's keys in Luwin's hands and set Bran in the high chair with a dozen men's hands under each wheel, and said to Rickon, "Do not bite men you like," and to Shaggy Dog, "Bite men you do not like," and to Summer, "Keep the door when door is needed," and to Grey Wind, "Go with my son." And then she rode and did not look back. Or if she looked back, it was at a tree that would keep looking forward for her. She looked older and she looked less tired. Being shaken by the road will do that. It puts the blood where it must be. She went to Walder Frey with words that gave him honors like carrots and then put the stick where it would be remembered. She made a bargain of the sort that leaves a bad taste in the mouth and saves a dozen lives for each mouthful. When Robb marched across the twins, his men shouted as if they'd won a battle. They had. It is a victory to cross a river when the man who owns the bridge is the kind of man who keeps a dock of grudges. Before dawn on the first day of the crossing, Jon went to the water's edge and let the cold come up around his boots. The green ran under a skin of mist like a thought trying to get itself said. Ghost stood with him and looked into the water as if hoping to see another wolf. On the far bank, the land lay with its morning hair still tangled. Somewhere beyond that lay Riverrun, smoking a little and putting on a brave mouth. Somewhere beyond that lay men in red and gold who had taught themselves to be casual with other men's lives. Somewhere beyond all of it lay a wall that was not a king's wall, whose stones had been set in a different kind of story, and the night behind it. "What are you thinking?" Theon asked, because he could not keep from poking any quiet as if it were a campfire that needed more sparks. "That I know what needs doing," Jon said. He did not turn. "And that knowing does not make the doing feel any lighter." Theon laughed. "If you wanted light work, you should have been born a second son to a usurped king and taught not to take what is not yours." Jon looked at him then, finally. Theon wore bright the way some men wear scar tissue. "Do you mean to send a raven to Pike and ask for ships?" Jon asked him, mild. Theon's grin sharpened. "I mean to send a letter that says the right things. My father will read it and do the wrong ones. I count on him." "You count wrong men and then call it luck when they upset your sums," Jon said. "Be sure you know what that kind of luck buys." The boy from the islands spread his hands as if presenting himself to a lord for judgment. "What else is there to buy in this world?" "Bread," Jon said. "Time, mercy, peace. He grimaced. "We cannot afford most of them." Catelyn returned from Freys Towers with a face that said she had swallowed a live thing and it had not died. She set her hand on Robb's arm and squeezed once, silent, and then the army flowed through the wet wood gates onto the bridge and across and out, and the twins shrank behind like a narrow mouth that had let a too large fish go because it had been flattered first. The air on the western bank felt the same and different. Jon breathed it and told himself there would be a day when he would breathe the air of Winterfell's yard again, and it would smell of bread and dogs and men whose swords were oiled because they were not being used. When scouts came in with word of Lannister host positioned wrong for the boy they learned later to call the young wolf, Jon was in the tent where Robb and Roose and Lady Catelyn and 2 Mormonts and a Glover had their heads bent over a map as if it were a table set for a thin supper. He listened to Robb choose to go west with the horse like an arrow and to send Roose with the foot to be the shield that a man must lift even if the arm trembles. He watched the way Catelyn's mouth moved and did not move. He watched Roose say "I will" and mean "I will" and not say for whom for longer than a moment at a time. "Ride with me," Robb said to Jon, and Theon made a noise as if the choice had been a slight upon his japes. "Take Ghost out and test the scent. If you lose the scent, follow the sound. It will be steel. We will change the shape of it when we arrive." Jon did not smile. He put his hand on the map for the space of a heartbeat the way his father had done, to feel the imagined shape of the roads under his skin. He took it away. "I'll be where you need me," he said. He rode with the van as the Horse River went west bent at the waist and low, and the land unrolled under them like a scroll whose writing had been read badly and must be read again at a gallop. The sound of a small battle carries in a different way to the sound of a large one. It's like hearing a door slam in the distance and knowing the house is on fire rather than only guests leaving. They came upon the perimeter at dusk. Hedgerows gapped and fields trampled. Men in red kicking embers to see if they could coax up a blaze. A banner torn and tied to a stake like a triage flag. Robb did not stop to make a speech. He pointed and men were where they needed to be, an old magic that is only discipline called by another name. The first clash was little and the second had teeth and the third had something like music to it because men began to remember the dances their grandfathers had taught them with sword and knee. Jon saw a Mormont woman split a man's helm with a blow that should not have been possible and then step back and hum under her breath as if checking the rhythm. He saw Theon loose a shaft with the lazy precision of a boy tossing an apple core and drop a man off a horse he had never learned to ride. He saw Robb carve a clean path toward the point where the 2 colors met and then not go further because a boy who wants the center of anything is a dead man's skull waiting to be taken up. There was blood and there was noise and there were 15 places where the thing could have gone away that would have been remembered as doom. It went the other way because the horse had been told that it could and the wolves knew where to put their teeth. When the dark came on, they owned a ring of space around their own fires and the Lannister men dead and dying owned the rest of the field. Jon ate his meat standing and did not taste it and slept like a man who falls into a trough and does not drown only because he forgets to breathe long enough. In the morning a raven found them, sauntering across the sky as if to a fair. It sat on a lance and let itself be taken and gave up a capsule with parchment that held too many hands at once. Varys's soft round letters sniffed at the edges. The royal green that had not known the feel of winter scratched in the corner. The words were a bargain wrapped in mercy. If Eddard Stark would take the black, if he would confess to treason, if he would swear his life to the Night's Watch, then the king would be merciful in a way that costs King's Landing only paper and breath. Catelyn reached for the scrap as if it were a raft tossed past. She caught it. It did not hold her weight. She held herself. Jon stood apart and read nothing and heard everything. Take the black. The words ran a circle in his head and connected to the part of him that had knelt before a heart tree and spoken to it in silence. If Eddard Stark went to the wall, he would be alive. He would be in tea. He wrong place and he would be alive. Jon wanted him alive more than he wanted the world to be right. And yet, he had learned enough to know the wrong place can kill a man as successfully as a sword. There are deaths with breath still in them. He went to Robb only after the first rush of voices had washed past and away. He found him at the edge of the camp, looking toward a copse where a bittern had decided to laugh at men. "Do we trust a paper?" Robb asked without turning. Written by a man with 2 soft hands while a woman with 2 hard eyes watches him write it? No, Jon said. But we cannot ignore it either. Robb's mouth went a strange way. I mean to refuse all their words and answer with steel until they answer with my father. That is a thing I can say while the fire is hot. When the coals go out and the dark comes, I will see my mother and think the other way. He scrubbed his face with his hand. If he goes to the wall, he lives. He would have life. He would have you. I have a different road, Jon said quietly. I had that road and I turned from it. If he comes to the wall, I will meet him there when the south of the north is done with me. He lifted his shoulders in something like a shrug and could not complete it. If the road lets me. Robb looked at him, then, as if seeing some shape in him he had known only in winter light and now was seeing under another sky. When this is done, he said, voice low enough that only Ghost might have heard it if Ghost had not decided to hunt moths. I will make a world where a man can be what he is and not have it argued from under his feet because men say other words around him. I will make a place where my mother and you can look at each other and nothing need be said that has been left unsaid for too long. Jon huffed something that was not quite laughter. Make the world, he said. I'll hold the corners while you stretch it. Before noon the horns blew from the east and then from the south, and the day that had been made for letters turned itself back into a day made for killing and not being killed. They moved. Jon moved with them. The paper lay on the table with a cup set on it to keep wind from turning it over. The wind turned it anyway and it lay face down, which seemed for a foolish instant like augury. In King's Landing a man sat in the dark and thought about what a promise costs. He smelled water and old stone and something sweeter that even the dark could not spoil. Varys came like a soft-footed woman into a nursery. He made words that were like gifts and like threats. Eddard Stark listened and was silent and then said a sentence that would have been small if it were any other man's. I did my duty, he said. I did it too slowly and without sufficient shrewdness, but I did it. The words lay in the dark like a blade put down purposely on a table. Varys sighed the way men sigh when a good plan has encountered a man who doesn't know the rules. Duty, he breathed. Such a northern word. If the wall were built of duty, my lord, the others would throw back their heads and weep for despair. Would they? Eddard asked mildly. Doubtless you have heard them weep. I have not. I mean to. He closed his eyes when Varys left. He saw a girl in a bed of blood, her hair dark with it, her eyes dry and desperate. He saw a boy with a wolf at his heel lifting his head to a wind that smelled of peat. He saw his own hands doing something he had never expected to have to do, bowing when he had made up his mind not to. He heard a voice that belonged to no maester and no crow and no eunuch say, "Promise me." The voice did not say to whom. Sansa stood in a garden and said the words men wanted from her and did not know which would save her and which would only make them more hungry to hear more. She wrote letters in a neat hand and tried to be careful with her ink so as not to blot a fate. She missed Arya like a missing limb. She missed her father like breath. She missed Winterfell 100 ways for each door. Joffrey spoke to her as if she were a cup of wine he had not yet tasted and was not certain whether he liked sweet or bitter. Cersei spoke to her as if she were a knife meant for someone else's back. When Sansa slept, she dreamed of snow falling upon the city until it went silent and clean. When she woke, the gulls had learned a new cry that she could not place. The road west bent, and the north went with it, a river of wool and iron and boiled leather. Jon rode where he was told and rode where he was needed, and sometimes those were the same place. He did not forget to watch the edges. He learned the language of banners half hidden by trees and of smoke some miles off. The color of it, the layer, the lift. He learned how to drink cold water from a stream without drinking more than his share. He learned the smell of his brother's courage and the smell of his fear, the two close kin. At night he lay on a cloak with Ghost's flank against his knee and looked at the stars when the clouds would let him. They were the same stars he had looked at from the roof of the first keep when he had been a boy counting future battles like sheep. They were the same stars Eddard Stark could not see in a room under stone. He counted them because counting is a way to tell yourself you are not lost. Some nights Ghost stood suddenly and looked north, as if a thing had called his name that only wolves hear. When Jon lifted his head, he would smell nothing different, hear no new sound. Still, he would put his hand on the wolf's shoulder and feel something in the skin under the fur, a tautness like a bowstring waiting for fingers. The world had a feeling of drawing itself to a knot. It would pull, and then there would be a place where the threads crossed. A hand would have to be steady there. A knife would have to be sharp. A boy would have to know who he was when the lines went taut. The wind shifted again, keener, carrying the smell of old fire and a new river ahead and the breath of men whose names Jon had not yet learned and would carry for the rest of his life. He pulled his cloak closer and did not feel the cold so much as tally it. Gray Wind slipped past and looked back with a grin that was all teeth and delight at the shape of danger. Jon followed, and Ghost went with him, and the road bent, and the day, which had started gray, decided to be clear. The woods west of the Twins were older than the men who walked into them that night, and they were not surprised by men. They took the horses and the iron and the whispers and made them part of their own breathing. The river lay to their right. A dark weight, not a thing you saw so much as felt in the air's damp and the little noises of things that live by water. Jon slid from his saddle and put his hand to Ghost's ruff to still him because stillness would keep them. The wolf's ears turned one way and then the other and came to point at the far bank as if listening to a song buried in the ground. Robb's hand dropped in the air and fell, and the men behind him sank to their haunches or bellies like grass in wind. They had learned this in the last days, learned to let weight down without noise, to move as if their mail were part of their bones. Catelyn stood under a beech with her cloak drawn tight about her and her hair caught back. She had ridden to this, and she would stand to it. She looked at the sleeping dark and thought of boys who had slept in rooms with shutters. She had made those rooms safe. Now she would make this place as safe as it could be by being here to watch the diecast. "The riders will come when the camp is quietest," she had said earlier over the map where the rivers crossed like ropes knotted by a blind hand. "Jaime Lannister will not sleep where the light lies. He will come to see the shade. Give him a reason to ride." And they had given one. Men with Glover's colors feigning a raid at the edge of the Lannister perimeter and then vanishing like foxes. A rumor driven like a nail into the right ears about a weakness in the line north of the Whispering Wood. Now the wood did whisper, but with its own leaves, with old stories. The camp fires of the Lannister host pricked the darkness like embers trapped under a grate. Between one light and another there were shadows, and in those shadows men shifted in their sleep and others rolled to their feet at a word they had learned not to question. Jon put his palm to the dry fold of bark beside his head and felt the tree's slow, patient business and took some of that pace into himself. When the first horses came, 4 lights, no more, the men with them had the quick padded steps of scouts. They were too careful to be fools. They went on. A long time after came more, a dozen, then 20, then a number Jon knew without counting because the breathing of that many animals in a close would make a particular sound only men who have heard it can name. The torches were kept low and less of them were lit than men would have liked. That told Jon the man riding at their center trusted his eyes and his luck more than his servants. It told him the man had been hunting in dark woods all his life. Jaime Lannister rode at ease, a pale ghost of brightness in the gloom. Jon saw the gleam of a gorget's edge, the pale fall of hair that made its own light where light should not be. The Kingslayer sat his horse as if a horse were a thought he had decided to have and set it moving. He was not armored for a siege or a pitched battle. He was armored to do something that felt like sport to him and murder to other men. His hand lay on the pommel of his sword as if it and the blade were part of his own arm, and he could not tell where he ended and the steel began. The signal was a gull's cry drowned in a cough. Men who had never been to the sea could make such a sound. They had practiced it until the owls were offended. The northern line rose like wheat under wind. Arrows loosed in a sound that is not a sound so much as a held breath let go. Horses screamed. Men swallowed the screams with their teeth. A rider went down with a grunt that felt indecent to hear. Ghost moved before Jon thought to move. The direwolf's body was a pale thought among the trees, a blade to cut a horse's hamstrings. Another wolf, Gray Wind, was a darker blade a few yards away, and that comforted Jon in a way he would not admit even to himself. that there were two of them, two halves of a thing they had made by looking at each other across Winterfell's yard for years. Jaime came through the first rush as if he had always intended to. His sword came out as easily as a man draws breath. He cut a man off his horse with a motion that had nothing in it of waste and then laughed, a bright sound in the dark that would have been charming if it were not terrible. Robb went at him as he had said he would, with his guard close and without the reckless plunge boys like at their first taste of fight. He had learned. The river had taught him. The burned farms had taught him. The weight of 100 banners had taught him. They met under a stand of alders, where the ground went under suddenly and treacherous if you did not know the way it tipped. Jaime saw the tip and used it. He used everything. His horse put its feet where he asked, and his blade did not hesitate. Robb matched him and matched him again and took 2 steps back because boys retreat when they are not fools. The men around them kept men away, and that was its own kind of duel. Men at the edges of other men's fates, teeth bared, shields turned, wolves in and out. Jon slid between trunks to the left, where one of the Lannister men had found the sense to try to loop and break the ring. He knocked the man's sword out wide with a blow that made his own wrist sing, felt the rebound up his forearm, followed with his left. The man went down looking more surprised than hurt, and Ghost was at his throat, not biting, just breathing, which is sometimes worse to a man's courage because it tells him the wolf has chosen to let him go. For now. Jon moved past into a pool of gloaming where no one had yet decided who owned it. Jaime's horse screamed then. That high raw sound that goes through a man's bones and makes him something else. Grey wind had taken the beast under the knee. The horse folded with a dignity horses have even when they are dying. Jaime rolled free in a way that would have been beautiful in a different hall for a different audience. He came up with his sword in his hand, and his smile tilted and then not tilted at all. He saw Robb and past Robb, the arc of men he would be cut from if he did not move very quickly. He did not move very quickly. He moved precisely. He cut at Robb's guard, and Robb's guard took it and gave back a blow that would have split another man to the breastbone. Jaime bent, and it glanced, and he laughed again, and then Jory would have been there if Jory had been alive, and instead Grey Wind was there, and a castle, and a Karstark, and a woman from Bear Island who had learned to hate lions in some private way. When it was done, Jaime Lannister was on his knees, and the point of Robb's sword hovered under his throat where the hollow is. The Kingslayer panted once, not afraid and not afraid. He lifted his chin to ease the bite. "If you were a man," he told Robb cheerfully through the blood at the corner of his mouth, "I'd say you'd made a good show of it." Robb's face in the torchlight looked like his father's face does when a man he respects disappoints him. "I am a man," he said mildly. "You're a prisoner." Something like delight ran across Jaime's face. "So I am," he agreed. "Make sure your men tie me up properly. It's dull work untying poor knots." He turned his head then, and his eye took in Jon in a long, appraising sweep. "Ah," he said, amused as a boy who has found a pretty shell. "The bastard. The one who thinks first and then stops thinking at the right time." Jon kept his face still and did not answer. Ghost sidled closer as if to ask whether this man wished to be eaten or only frightened. Grey Wind put his nose into Jaime's hair and sneezed, and then took himself away as if bored. They took the camp before the dark had properly gathered itself. The men around Jaime did not know whether to fight harder because they loved him or to stop because they could not imagine him being taken. Some chose the first and died admirably. Some chose the second and lived and shook for a time in the shadows behind the siege engines, as men do when the shape of the world they have made cracks with a sound too loud to ignore. By dawn, Robb had held his first Lannister, and his men cheered and whispered at once. Catelyn came into the ring with her face like iron. She looked at Jaime as if measuring him for a box and finding him either too large or too small. She did not yet know which. "My lords," she said to the men about her without taking her eyes off the Kingslayer, "you will leave us a moment." She lifted her hand. "That includes you, Theon." Theon made his mock bow and dragged his feet just enough to be noticed and no more. Jon did not move. Catelyn's eyes flicked to his and away. "You may keep your wolf," she said evenly. "I am not foolish." She came closer to the captive and the wolf. "Ser Jaime." "Lady Stark." Jaime answered with courtly grace from his knees. "You've grown more beautiful since I last did not see you." Catelyn studied him as a woman examines a knife someone has handed her, to see whether it is sharp and which way it cuts. "Your men burned a dozen steadings between the Blue Fork and the Tumblestone," she said. "They left the kind of silence behind that takes generations to fill. My father cannot speak for more than a minute without swallowing pain. My brother lies in a cell within sight of the rooms where he slept as a boy. I am curious, sir, if you have anything to say that is not clever." He smiled anyway. Men like him can always find a smile. "I am a poor man's captive," he said. "Clever is what I have." He tilted his head. "Let's trade then. My life for your daughters." Catelyn did not breathe, but her mouth made a small movement that might have been the ghost of a word. "You will have no life to trade if you say that too boldly in the wrong hall," she said softly. "My daughters are—" Her throat moved. "My daughters are not in your pocket, sir. They are in a queen's." "She is worse than a pocket," Jaime agreed with a reflective air, as if truly weighing the matter. "She has holes in her and doesn't know where." Jon wanted to step forward then, to put himself between that mouth and his lady, to insert his own presence like a flat stone under a wheel. Ghost felt him tense and thumped his tail lightly once against Jon's shin, a reminder of the body he occupied and of its limits. Robb had not gone. He stood with his hand on Grey Wind's neck, listening. "He lives," he said at last, at a pitch meant for Catelyn. He meant Jaime. He also meant his father. He meant the future. "Camps first," he added, and that snapped men back to what had to be done next. They broke the camps at dawn as a man breaks a crust to get at bread. The Lannister lines had been laid out with care and fed with the fat of the Riverlands. Men from Derry and Piper and Blackwood, from the Frey levies and the west-facing houses, swarmed across trenches and pushed the timber hurdles that had been meant to outweight them. The air got a taste to it that men who survive to have white hair never forget. Jon found himself with his boot in a man's ribs and did not remember how he had chosen that particular rib. He found himself setting an old man on his feet and turning his head so that the man would not see his son in the mud behind him. He found Ghost ahead of him and suddenly behind him, and then he lost the wolf altogether in smoke and did not panic because the body learns to trust what it has learned. When it cleared, Riverrun's towers stood with the light finding their edges and making them seem drawn rather than grown. The red and blue trout flew on the highest keep. On the lower wall, a dozen men who had thought they would die that week shouted themselves hoarse, naming a boy lord. They cried the Tully words until they were only sound, and then cried stark, and then cried for water, and women in battered dresses brought them what they asked. They found Edmure Tully not in a cell but on a pallet trussed like a pig to be transported when a certain assessment of his value had been completed. He looked better than a man in that position has any right to look, and made a jest as soon as they cut the rope at his ankles. "Sister," he wheezed at Catelyn, "you bring lions as bed warmers, and you bring wolves to chase them off. I cannot tell if you've learned too much or too little in your marriage." Catelyn held his face between her hands and studied him as if counting the bones. "You will live," she said, "and if you make one more joke about bed warmers, I will set you in the river with stones." Hoster Tully received his daughter in a chamber full of clean light and dirty breath. He had grown small where once he had filled a room. He tried to sit straighter in his chair when Catelyn came with the stain of the road after her, but the weight of the gout was a man sitting on his chest. He made room for Catelyn in his gaze and for Robb, and then his eyes moved to Jon because men's eyes move to wolves and to marks of bastardy whether they wish to or not. "You smell of the north," he said to Jon with old courtesy that had not lost its edge, "and of war, which is not a smell I like on any man. Are you the boy Ned kept to his left hand when he needed to pretend to be cruel?" Jon bowed his head. "I am Jon Snow," he said. "I am Lord Stark's man." He left out "and son" and the old man's "e." Yes told him he had said more by leaving it out than he could have by adding it in. Hoster's mouth twitched with something that might have been amusement and might have been a grimace of pain. "A man ought to be seen for who he is," he murmured. "But we make do with who men will let us be." He coughed and waved them away and spoke to Catelyn in a voice no one else had any right to hear, and she stood and took the words like stones and put them in her pockets to carry later. News runs. It runs fast when it is bad. Before the night had steeped itself, a raven struck the river keep hard enough to startle men, and Ser Desmond Grell's hands shook when he took the thing from the leather tube, though he would never have admitted it. The parchment inside looked like any parchment. It did not feel like any parchment. Words carry weight, and this paper had been made heavy in the hand by what it bore. Eddard Stark went to the steps of the Sept in a city where a man cannot be heard or is heard too much. The bells tolled because bells always do when men take it upon themselves to grant the gods courtesy that costs nothing. He said he had betrayed the crown. He said he had been led by ambition and by a love for his own blood. He said he had sought to put aside a rightful king. He said, according to the scribe who wrote it down through tears or wine, that he was a traitor. He said it because a soft-voiced man had told him to, because a queen had nodded agreement, because another man would be merciful, because life had been placed in one pan of a scale and honor in the other, and he was a northern man and knew what dead men do not spend. The boy in the crown stood up when he should have sat and said a sentence of his own. It was not the one that had been written for him. It was the one boys say when the world is tipped against them and they wish to prove they are heavier than it is. He said, "Bring me his head." The words crossed fields faster than riders could and birds faster than wind. They opened men where they passed and left them stumbling and not knowing whether they could go on. Catelyn read them because the paper had been put in her hands and she could not ask another to bear it. She did not make a sound. She folded the words in half and then in half again and set them on the table as if they were a child who had finally gone to sleep. Robb's hand went to the knife at his belt and then dropped as if the leather had burned. Edmure swore and knocked over the wine and did not wipe it. The great Jon laughed rawly and broke his laughter with a curse and broke the curse with another. Roose Bolton's mouth made a precision instrument for breath. Jon did not move. He felt the words pass into him and lodge in a place that would not heal. He could put breath around them. He could not make the breath change them. Ghost pressed his head against Jon's thigh and made a noise that in a wolf is either comfort or rage and sometimes both. Jon put his hand on the skull and thought of a god's wood with a white face and red tears dried, and thought of a man at a window with ink-stained fingers, and thought of a boy who would never ride again, and thought of a girl in a garden where snow falls in summer. He did not weep. He learned something about himself in that silence, and not all of it was kind. The hall where the lords gathered when there is nothing to be done and everything to decide smelt of smoke and wool and iron and grief. Hoster Tully had himself carried there and looked at them all out of eyes that had seen money changed for marriages and oaths. Catelyn stood beneath her father's chair. She had a quiet like an empty well. If you leaned over it, you might fall in and not know why. The great Jon spoke first because men like him cannot help it. "The South thinks to make names for us," he bellowed, and in his bellow was a pain too big for most men to carry inside their mouths. "Traitor, rebel, wolf, bastard, let them keep their names and choke on them. They murdered the hand of the king because he was honest. They keep his girl to make us dance. They send us words as if we're beagles to come at their whistle. I know another word." He wrenched his sword up, and the sound it made coming free was too loud and then exactly right. He drove its point against the floor so the boards groaned. "King," he said. "A king we can follow. A king who knows our weather. A king who will not bend when they tell him to. The king in the north." The word rang in men as if it had been waiting all along to be said. Glover took it up, not roaring, speaking it like a prayer. Karstark spat on the floor and nodded as if to himself and then said it, low and stubborn. Mormont's woman said it with the decided air of a matron laying a child into a cradle she has made herself. One by one the Riverlords said it too, because they had eyes and could see which way the world was going and knew they could live in that world if they helped to make it. When they began to bend the knee to Robb, it was not a matter of courtesy. It was the shape of a new truth forming in a hall warmed by grief. Jon went to one knee with them, not because he is his brother's man only, though he is, but because he saw in Robb's face something that did not come from any crown and was not given by any man. Catelyn watched with the attention she has always had for her sons, and the softest part of her mouth trembled and then did not. She did not kneel. She had knelt at a different altar and had paid and paid. She stood. "Rise," Robb said, voice roughened by the new weight upon his shoulders. "Rise, and we will go on." He turned to Catelyn as if he were a boy again for a heartbeat. "Mother, be a king or do not," she said steadily. "But do not be half a thing. Half a thing gets men killed twice." They rose and the room went on with its breathing. The business that follows a crown began at once, because if you do not put your hands to it, it rises up and drowns you. Who would carry word to White Harbor to bind Manderley to their bread? Who would ride to the mountain clans and make them feel seen? Who would go to the Neck and ask the reeds for their eyes? Who would face Walder Frey again and not strike him and then find something he would like better than his own reflection? Who would hold the West Roads? Who would sit by Hoster's bed and say the old words so he could step into the river properly when at last he must? Robb appointed and refused to be led. He listened to Roose with his eyes and to the great John with his shoulders and to Catelyn with his bones. He sent ravens to Bear Island and Carhold and Deepwood Motte and Oldcastle. He sent Theon Greyjoy east on a salty wind with a letter and the kind of hope men do not admit they have because it makes them look like fools. Catelyn put her hand to her mouth and then took it away again and did not forbid it because there are some foreshadowings you may not speak without dragging them down upon you. When the council broke at last, the hall cleared in eddies and currents like a river around a stone. Jon remained where he was for a time because his body had forgotten how to be anything but still. Ghost got to his feet and shook himself and the sound broke a small spell. "You will not go to the wall now," Catelyn said behind him, not a question, not cruel. The words were like a flake of ice. "Not now," Jon said. He turned and met her eyes because he had learned to. "But I promised my father once. And a raven has told us the night grows teeth." He touched his breastbone because that was where the hurt lay. "If there is any breath left when this road's end is named, and if my king releases me for that part of my oath, I will go." Catelyn breathed in once, sharply. For a moment the woman who feared for her sons and hated the thought of his presence in their house put her hand on the edge of her own heart. "I do not forgive the world its shape," she said in a tone that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with him. "But I am learning the names of things I thought I would not have to name." She looked at Ghost. "Keep him," she said to the wolf, as if commanding a thing she knew could not be commanded. Ghost tipped his head and his red eyes were other and same. In the days that followed, Jon learned how a keep becomes a court when someone calls a boy a king in its halls. He learned the procession of men who consider themselves first and men who consider themselves last. He learned to put a hand lightly on a shoulder and turn a man half a handbreadth so he would address the right person and not the wrong and thereby make fewer enemies. He learned how to sleep in snatches and how to rise without making noise. He learned to put his anger in his glove and only put it on when he meant to strike. He learned that Sansa's name should not be spoken in some conversations and that Arya's should be spoken in others, and that both girls are balances men will try to swing. He wrote letters in his slow, neat hand to Maester Luwin and told him things that needed telling and left out the things that did not belong in anybody's ink. He walked the riverbank and watched Riverrun's waters do their old work, turning wheels and carrying leaves and reflecting sky. Catelyn came there sometimes to stand as if she could outstare the current. Edmure went to the practice yard and worked at his sword with a furious concentration that would make him better if he lived long enough. Hoster dozed and woke and spoke to men who were not there and then to his daughter, who was, and said enough like wisdom that men left the room quietly. A raven came from King's Landing with a different hand in its lines a week after the crown had been said. It said Renly Baratheon had put a crown upon his own head in the south, in a pretty field with a tolerable speech, and had married a girl with flowers in her hair who smiled at him as if she had wanted exactly that crown. It said the Stormlands and the Reach were his. It said Stannis had left Dragonstone and would say a thing of his own soon, and that thing would have fewer smiles in it. It said the imp had done something clever with hill tribes and Tywin had set up a table and laid maps upon it and did not intend to get up soon. It said Cersei did not sleep and that Varys did, and that in both were messages men could read if they had the patience to trace the breath of others. Robb listened to it all and measured a day and a half and then sent his mother to the south again. to Renly with a plain offer wrapped in a truth and a threat outspoken with grace. "I go because I must," Catelyn told Jon that afternoon. Her mouth tipped with resignation and something like relief at least having her hands on the work. "I do not go because I like to be a crow among peacocks. The boy thinks himself a king because he likes how his hair falls around the crown. The older brother thinks himself a king because he likes the taste of laws in his mouth. Both may be kings. Neither will be a father to my daughters. But one may be a sword to kill the other. And while they weigh steel with words, I want to see who listens when I speak of dead men and live girls." "Be careful," Jon said. He did not tell her to come back. Words can pull men back from edges they should have gone over. "Keep 2 men you trust on either side and a third behind. Trust the man behind more." She gave him a look that had the ghost of an old insult in it and the beginning of an old kindness. "You sound like him," she said. "Your father, when he was young and believed his words could be made iron in the right mouth." "I will try to let my words ask less of the world than his did," Jon said. He did not promise it. At night, when he finally found a straw pallet and the right to fall into it, sleep came like a blow. When it didn't, Ghost would lift his head and the 2 of them would go down to the outer ward and stand where the smell of the water could be had. The stars were clearer here than they had been in the south. They were not the same stars as Winterfell's, which is a foolishness, but he felt the difference anyway. The north sits a man differently under the sky. It makes him belong to the ground in another way. Sometimes he dreamed, and when he did, the dreams came in a way that was like a story told by someone too wise to finish it. He was in the God's Wood, not Winterfell's and not any he knew. The heart tree was a pale hand raised, and the face in it had been cut by no man. It had learned how to be a face in the snow summers and winter summers both. A woman stood with hair black as a raven's wing and eyes as tired as a woman's after a long labor. And she said a word that was more breath than meaning, a name he did not know he knew. He woke with his mouth full of the taste of iron and the sound of wind under stone in his ears. Ghost lay with his red eyes open, watching the space at the edge of the pallet where nothing stood. The river went on rising and falling in its old cradle. The men who had crowned a boy learned to be his men. The boy learned to be their king and to sleep as little as kings must. The world turned its face to winter, and the birds started to leave the hedges. Up beyond the world's top, where there are no hedges for birds to leave, a horn was put to a mouth in the night and was not blown because the man holding it did not wish to wake the thing he heard beyond the trees. Jon stood at the top of a tower one morning with frost still in its teeth and watched a skein of geese go south with their letters of V's. And he counted them because counting things that cannot be kept is sometimes the only way to keep yourself. He thought of a city by the green sea where a girl walked with her hand on a dragon's egg and did not know what it would cost to be warm. He thought of an island where a brother counted laws the way misers count coin and found them wanting. He thought of a keep of black stone where a man with a red woman at his shoulder looked into a fire and told himself he saw the shapes he wanted. He thought of a wreck of timbers on rocks where a king waited for a letter to come in a boy's hand and smiled with all his teeth but not with his eyes. He thought of a line of ice and old spells where his father might have stood if the world had turned its face half a hand differently. "Jon," Robb said behind him, in the voice that meant a boy and a king were speaking at once. "Ride with me. There's a valley 2 miles west where the scouts say the ground goes to stone. I want to see what a map cannot say." "Always," Jon said, and looked once more north before he turned. The wind came down that way with a different edge on it. Men call such things imagination. Wolves call them weather. He touched Ghost's ear, and the 2 of them went down the steps into the morning that had promised itself frost and delivered. The day offered work and men to do it. He took his share and did not fail it, and behind his ribs the hurt went with him like a small white coal he kept from going out because some fires must be kept even when they burn. The valley west of Riverrun was made of gray bones, ribs of limestone rising and falling under scrub and thorn, and the wind ran its hands along them, making a low note that set men's teeth on edge. Robb reined up at the lip and sat a moment as if he were listening to the ground. Jon watched the way Grey Wind's ears pricked and the way the great wolf's gaze drifted to the left where a cut in the stone let the world slip through in a narrow way. "There," Robb said. "There, Jon agreed, because Ghost had already flowed forward a pace to look and then back to Jon's knee, waiting. They rode the edge. Below, a handful of old stone lay scattered where some farmer's wall had given up decades ago and let the sheep choose their own border. The place looked empty until a man trained to see men looked long enough. Then the emptiness showed seams. A print too clean where a hoof had cut into damp. A bird that should have flown and hadn't and then flew all at once. Robb breathed out a low sound through his teeth that Grey Wind answered without thinking. They didn't go down. They sent a pair of spears to circle right and another to Ghost left along the ridge with the wolves. And they waited with the patience men learn when they have been taught that good things happen to those who do not turn into fools when they see an enemy's shadow. The enemy was there. Their color muted under travel cloaks, the cut of their leather western. Their reins held with the loose insolence Lannister riders acquire even when no one is looking at them. A dozen, maybe 15. They sat their horses quiet, looking back the way they had come. Waiting to. Scouts, Jon said. Riders for a larger band, Robb said. He turned his head slightly. If we take them loud, the band will scatter. If we take them soft, we learn where the band fattens. Jon looked to the cut in the stone again. Soft, he said. The cut is a bottleneck and the ground their cup's noise. If we wait long enough, they'll turn their heads to the left to listen for their friends. We go then. Robb grinned, quick as a boy then gone again, and touched Grey Wind's neck. The wolf went down the slope without a sound, as if he had always lived in limestone ribs. Ghost went with him, his white coat the color of light drawn thin. The men to the left reached the stony shelf and lay along it like fallen branches. Jon took 3 men down the right-hand fall with his knees loose and his right hand balanced at the mare's withers. He made himself forget the horse's legs. He remembered stone and wind and the shape of the men below. The moment arrived as if the valley breathed it. One of the Lannister riders turned his head a fraction to the left. Another's horse lifted its head to look that way as well. A third scratched under his chin with the point of a glove. Robb's whistle was one note and thin as a gnat. The wolves moved. The men moved with them, not faster. No man outruns a direwolf, but in the same rhythm. The first rider never got his blade out. Ghost was at his boot and then at his knee and then gone. The second lifted a horn and set it back without blowing because Grey Wind had taken hold of the hand that held the horn and the hand had decided it belonged to another man for a moment. Jon went at the third, his sword up in a tight arc meant to knock aside an instinctive parry, and then he was in the man's eye and the man was on the ground with dust in his beard, and Jon was past him and turning. They did not kill all of them, for men went down with ropes around wrists and ankles, cursed like men who have never been knot-tied. They took the rest because a wolf at a horse's leg is honest persuasion. When the last of the shouting had been done, Robb rode down and looked at the prisoners with his head cocked a little. He had his father's way of counting a man without telling him he was being counted. "You'll take us to your friends," he said to the least frightened one, a man with a scar from ear to jaw that had almost learned to be part of his smile. "And you'll tell them this, the young wolf is hunting. Tell them they will live if they put down their swords and tell me where their lord lays his head at night." The man spat dust and laughed once. "You're no wolf," he said, too lightly. "You're a boy. You'll be a wolf when you've learned how to kill sleeping men and not wake their wives." Robb's eyes went colder by a notch. "I have learned to choose what killing buys," he said. "That will be enough." They drove the captured riders ahead along the ridge. Jon left 2 men to wipe the prints from the limestone with pine branches and to walk the horses where they had passed until the stone forgot. It was the sort of work he had grown good at these last weeks. Swords matter in bright moments. The small hours are decided by the man who thinks of the shape of a hoofprint in drying mud and cares enough to alter it. By the time they made the descent to the main body of the host, the light had gone to the flat gold of a day that intends to turn cold at dusk. Robb took the measure of the captured men again, then handed 2 over to Glover's lads with orders to ease them a little apart and water them before the proper talking, and gave the others to Ser Wendell Manderly's retainers with instructions on knots that would not chafe. He had learned how to be kind and orderly in the same breath. Men notice when a lord keeps them from hating their work. Roose will be wanting to know how many boots step in the west, Theon said, as if he were tossing bread to ducks, leaning on a spear with the end of it planted in a puddle so shallow it wasn't worth the name. And a raven from my father will be wanting me to pretend to read it. Robb's eyebrow lifted. You'll ride tomorrow, he said, and Theon's grin faltered briefly because sometimes bravado trips on its own feet. Not to your father, to the Tall Hearts and the Serwyn levies. Bring them to me by the Stony Fork and then ride on to Lady Mormont's people and tell them to bite where I point. If you see a red banner with 5 golden cups above a field, Rafford's men, Theon guessed. Marbrand's, Jon said. He favors red and sends his cups to drink another man's grain. I want to see him without him seeing me. Theon flicked him an insolent salute. And what does Eddard Stark's shadow want? He drawled. To be the ground, Jon said, automatic now, and Theon laughed, because he always did when Jon said single true things without ornament. The ravens came in the hours between sunset and true dark, as they often do because men who write letters imagine night traveling faster. One bird had the strip of iron green ribbon tied to its leg that Catelyn had taken to using when sending word back from the south. Renly had received her under pavilion and rose braided bow and thrones of bright men. He was full of smiles and wine and armies. He wanted to talk of marrying the north to the south with a garland and a song. He wanted Robb's homage as a friend rather than demand it as a king. He spoke of the Tyrells as if he had been born with a rose in his mouth. Stannis had sent his own letter, terse and cold and held at arm's length. The line of law, the proof of bastardy written in features, the charge of incest, the claim, that sober word, stated as if the man had been chiseling it into stone. Renly and Stannis were at swords in speech. Soon enough the swords would be iron. He'll be dead, Galbart Glover said under his breath after the letter had gone around the inner ring and touched men's fingers. One man who thinks in law and one who thinks in feasts, and a shadow behind both. He'll be dead in the worst way a man dies. We are not in that tent, Robb said, steady. We cannot make the choice for them. We will be ready to live with the one they make. Another bird wore a black thread. Maester Luwin's small, precise hand. The sky to the north had grown strange for 3 dawns running. A red spear had drawn across it in the night like a wound, so men said, and men were prone to see wounds where there were only weather. But Luwin had written with a care that suggested he had counted the hours the red had lingered and had been made uneasy against his learning. Osha had told Bran in the yard that red in the sky meant blood for kings and tears for wolves. Luwin had not censured her in the margin, which made Jon colder than a correction would have done. There were raiding ships off the stony shore that wore no flag known to him from White Harbor's watch. Tallheart's men were gone from Torrens Square to chase a party inland who had land-borne their way up from the stony shore like splinters under skin. Boats? Theon murmured, his smile crooked. Someone's father got clever while the other fathers were writing letters. You promised me ships, Robb said without heat. I hope your father hears our need more than his pride. My father's pride is his only ear, Theon said, cheerful as a boy walking into a dark house to steal apples because the taste is worth the switches later. You'll ride anyway, Robb said as if he had not heard that. You'll carry my words to Carhold and the Dreadfort. Tell them the river's turn has shifted the stones. Tell them to keep watch on the stony shore. Tell Lady Dustin I mean to write her husband into my ledgers when he chooses a side with his ink and not only with his mouth. And tell my mother I will hear what her kings say and answer with the truth we can buy with steel. Theon's eyes glittered. I've always liked the look of Flint's finger, he said carelessly. If your crown is big enough, my Lord King, perhaps you'll let me wear one of its rings. Robb did not answer. He had learned when silence is a better answer and when it is merely a man being too tired to talk. That night the sky did show a wound. Jon saw it when he woke to Ghost's gentle scrape of claws on the tent door flap. He stood in the opening with the cold on his bare arms and the camp lying like a sleeping beast about him and the river grumbling under its own breath. To the east the heavens held a long smear of red that had no right to be there, wrong as a blush on a corpse. Men had always read the sky as if it were a letter a god had taught them to sound out. Jon read this one and did not like the words. ghost lifted his muzzle and made a sound he did not make for men or for rabbits. The sound had the taste of another sort of cold in it. For a moment Jon wasn't on a riverbank in the west with a crown he had not wanted on his brother's hair. He was in a godswood breathing the smell of old iron and sap and hearing water count itself in the dark, and beyond the godswood the snow lay, and beyond the snow something moved that was not alive and yet made men feel like prey. The next day they pushed west again with caution paid out like rope. A little and then another little. Paid them back. Marbrand's men were 2 valleys over and moving toward the causeway rode under gray banners that made themselves small under the cloud. Robb let them go and went somewhere else instead, silent as wolves go when they are not ready to howl yet. Jaime Lannister rode through all of it with his hands tied and his mouth as busy as a summer field. He talked to every man near him. He talked to the wolves when they came to look at him and laugh through their noses. He talked to Jon whenever Jon was foolish enough to come within replying distance. You carry yourself like a man who has something heavier than his sword on his back, Jaime observed one afternoon as the light failed too quickly to make it a kindness. We all do, of course. Duty, guilt, old maester's books. But yours sits on you like a cloak that doesn't fit. You've not found the tailor who knows your size. I am not in want of a tailor, Jon said curtly. Tightening the strap on the old destrier, they'd assigned the Kingslayer to keep him from believing himself too comfortable. I am in want of a war being done. Oh, all of us, Jaime said cheerfully. When it's done, there will be another, because men like me and men like you find we have become good at something and the world will not stop giving us reasons to do it. Your father would have been very good at making peace if someone had killed all the liars for him. Someone tried, Jon said. Came out before he could stop it. They used a sword. It did not work. Jaime's smile showed teeth. Oh, it works, he said. Just not in the way we like to think it does. You'll find that out when you have to decide which lie lives and which dies. We all do, even men who think they only ever speak truth. Your sister says the same, Jon said flat. Of course she does, Jaime said, delighted. She is the other half of my tongue. Listen there, that's better. Don't make me like you. It would be inconvenient. Jon left him. Talking to Jaime Lannister felt like running a fine blade along your own fingers to see whether you could feel the sharp. He slept badly after and woke with Ghost lying at his back, the wolf's chest rising and falling slow and as steady as counting. He put his hand on the ruff and felt the heat. He did not need a tailor. He needed to feel earth under his feet that belonged to him, and the words of men he trusted, and the smell of snow in air that had remembered how to be clean. A week later the ravens came like hail. One struck hard enough to break a twig in the little polyglot of trees beside the command tent. The strip under its leg was smeared with ash where a man had put his seal on with fingers not wholly clean. Maester Luwin's hand again and quicker. Raiders at the stony shore wearing krakens in iron. Torrhen's square beset. Lady Hornwood sent word that Mormont's women had bloodied 3 longships and burned one. Hother Umber, Crowfood, had taken a head at Sea Dragon Point and laughed with his single eye as if he had been given a capon, and another, thinner, line at the end, as if the maester had been thinking whether it belonged. A man calling himself Reek had come from the Dreadfort to serve to Lady Hornwood, greasy-haired and stinking, but handy and eager to please. Lady Hornwood had taken him into her kitchens. Luwin did not add the question mark, but it was in the ink. The Dreadfort's men are out on the stony shore, Robb said. Roose sent word he'd dispatch his bastard to clear raiders. That's a long road for a bastard to ride. The Dreadfort's roads are always long when you follow them with your eyes, Galbart Glover said, grimacing. When you ride them, they turn out to be shorter than you'd like. Robb looked down at the map as if it might lower its voice and explain itself if he made himself quiet enough. We'll have to crack the west quick and slip back north between the fingers, he said. If Fry keeps his bridge for us. He'll keep it, Catelyn's letter had said. For a price. She had added the price in her tidy hand. Olivar to be squire to Robb, little Valdas to feel important, a future marriage to be written in sand and turned into something else later. The letter had smelled faintly of rose water and river damp. It felt like the south and the north at once and made Jon's heart heavy for reasons he could not put in words. They cracked the west quick enough to be called clever by their own men and lucky by their foes. Oxcross lay like a hand splayed over valleys and fields. Men fought over it because you could build pieces of a kingdom from its fingers. Robb went through the fingers like a boy who has decided to walk the ridges between rows of crops and not fall no matter how his mother calls. He hit Stafford Lannister not in the face he had put toward them but on the side he thought he had tucked away, and the Golden Boys broke in a manner that would make for songs in another generation among men who had not bled there. They left a field of dead pale hair and bright, spilt blood. They left something of theirs there too, because there is no victory that does not take its tithe. One of the ravens that came 2 days after did not wear any color under its leg. It wore grease on its tube and mud on its feet and a smell like kitchen soap and dog. Jon recognized Maester Luwin's hand before Robb broke the seal. He did not breathe while his brother read. Grey Wind lifted his head and laid it down again, as if he had decided the mood of the tent did not require him. Ser Rodrik rode out from Winterfell to lift Torrhen's Square, Robb said, the words precise because if they were not his mouth would forget how to shape them. He took most of the men who could sit a horse. He left men enough for a gate and 3 nights' watch, he thought, and a stubborn boy and a woman from beyond the wall who knows how to hear trouble. He left Bran and Rickon and Arya. Theon Greyjoy came in by the Hunter's Gate with 20 men who moved like cats and spoke the names of men who had served in our yards. He has taken Winterfell. The tent made a sound as if it had been struck from within. Theon, who had been gone 3 days, wasn't there to hear his name grow sharp in other men's mouths. Catelyn was 200 miles away talking to a boy with a crown grown too soon on his head. Jon stood very still. He felt something in him shut a door. It did not lock it, pulled it closed to keep from falling in. How? Galbart Glover demanded, hoarse. How do you take Winterfell with 20 men? How do you get through gates meant to keep kings out? You open the gate, Roose Bolton said quietly. He had come in late, silent as his own eye. You wear a man's face we want to see. You come by dusk when cooks have a pot to mind. You say a name and men move to make room for it. Robb's hand closed into a fist and opened again. He looked at Jon as if he had forgotten for a moment where he was and who had the right words. What does the letter say after? He asked. Jon took it and read fast because slow would be cowardly now. Lady Hornwood had vanished from her own hall. Her men had found her ring finger on the kitchen table, her ring still on it, as if she had set it there to be counted with the others things she could not carry with her. Torrhen's Square was relieved by Ser Rodrik, who was gathering men in the rills and at Cerwyn to march back. The man calling himself Reek had left Hornwood's kitchens and slipped away to the Dreadfort again with his pay. Osha had whispered to Luwin that the old gods were restless. Bran said the Red Star watched. Arya had laughed and told Rickon that stars do not watch. Rickon had thrown an apple at her and Shaggy Dog had eaten it at once. Luwin had tried to make sense of old Nan's stories and failed and ended with one of his own. Keep the children in the crypts if the walls are breached and bar the door and wait for Ser Rodrik. They will not keep the crypt door with a bar if a Greyjoy brings a ram, Roose said, eye-lidded. But a Greyjoy may not bring a ram if he thinks the crypt's haunted. And Greyjoys are men who believe in things when the sea tells them to. Ser Rodrik will be there before this raven's ink dries twice, Jon said. He will put Theon Greyjoy up on his own pig gallows if he touches a hair on Bran's head. And Arya will not be in the crypts. She'll be in a place where she can take a little piece out of some man's calf when he isn't looking. At that, Robb's mouth twisted in a way that made him for a moment a boy again. She will, he said. 7 hells she will. He put his hand over his eyes and pressed until his knuckles went white. When he dropped it, his face was a king's. We move north. We cannot, Roose said, not cruel, not kind, just exact. If we turn now, with half the west not yet broken to the hilt, they will cut us in the river's throat. Tywin Lannister moves from Harrenhal as soon as we do and puts us between his teeth and his table. Your mother has not yet returned with anything but words. If you leave now, you leave your mother in the hands of words. Robb turned, the movement small but dangerous. What would you do, Lord Bolton? he asked with a politeness that could cut. Give the kraken my hall and my brothers and call it even with the lion because we were clever with his cubs? I would do what keeps our bread from being baked in another man's oven before we have a chance to eat, Roose said, unruffled. I would send men as if I were moving all, and then I would move only some, and I would send better men than the Greyjoy has ever met to do work in lanes he does not know. I would take back your house with rats and knives while I face your other foe with banners. And when the Greyjoy thinks he hears your feet, I would have planted men in places his ears cannot find. I'll go, Jon said before Robb could fix on a decision and make it law. With the wolves and 30 men who know how to move, we'll go by the marsh paths without banners. We'll bring Ser Roderick word of what we see and make trouble for anyone who isn't wearing our colors. We'll show Theon his door is not as wide as he thinks it is. Silence held for a heartbeat. The tent breathed. No, Robb said finally, soft as the North's first snow. I need you here. You are the part of me that looks where I do not when I am looking at a map and a man in the same moment. If I send a knife home, I'll send men who are knives and nothing else. I'll send Daisy Mormont with 30 of her choosing. I'll send Meej's ghost of Bear Island with her. If there's a man has a way through the marsh and knows how to make his feet lie to the land, I'll put him at their head. Galbart, find me a man of the reeds who owes you coin. Roose, write to your bastard to take his road faster and not stop to make ornaments of other men's finger bones. Roose inclined his head. As my king commands, he said, and if there was anything else in the words, the tent did not choose to hear it. A third raven came with seal broken and resealed with a blob of wax so messy it looked like a child's. The letter inside was in a hand that thought itself fine and wasn't. The words writhed, oiled, wanting to be admired for themselves and not what they said. Theon Greyjoy, styling himself Prince of Winterfell, wrote to King Robb with the familiarity of a man putting his feet on a table that isn't his. He spoke of the sea as if Robb had not been birthed under a sky that smells of snow instead. He said the iron price had been paid, and the North could keep itself if it kept to itself and let the shore belong to men who understood it. He offered, as if generosity were his to dispense, to keep Bran and Rickon and Arya well if Robb recognized him as master of the coasts and did not march home with the river's smoke in his hair. He wrote Sansa's name once, as if forgetting which Stark girl he had, and then scratched it out in a way that left a bruise of ink. Robb read it twice. Theon, he said, more to the air than to any man. He folded the paper carefully, each edge precisely to the next, and then fed it into the firepot without looking away. He watched it catch and curl and blacken. He will learn what it is to sleep under snow, he said, no louder. He will learn to be cold and to hunger. He will learn what we do with men who write to us like that. Jon stood with his hands at his sides so that they would not betray him by reaching for the map and pointing north. He felt the choice inside him like a coin in the mouth. If he flipped it, he would not be able to put it back. He set his jaw and didn't flip it. 2 nights later, Daisy Mormont slipped away from the eastern edge with 30 hard women and harder men. They carried no heraldry and wore no cloak they could not leave in a ditch. They took a guide from a family that had been in Robb's train since they crossed the Twins. Short folk with muddy ankles and frog spear scars along their calves who had called themselves Reed without giving cause for it. They went with their mouths closed and their eyes open and their knives where knifing could be done in wet places. Jon stood at the edge of camp and watched them vanish into the dark like water becoming not water. Ghosts stood long after they had gone, tasting the air. The wolf's hackles lay flat, which was the best omen a man can get when sending friends into a place without bells. By day they kept pressure on the west. The gold lions retreated without giving up believing themselves lions. By night the letters from the north came in a drip like thaw in a cave. Winterfell's gate closed. A body hung from the inner parapet with a woolen sack over its head. The boy who had asked a question too loudly had been set there to stop other questions. Osha had seen Theon walk the wall with a smile he was practicing. Bran had spoken in his sleep and Summer had howled. And a man in a red cap had crossed himself without knowing he did it. The crypt doors had moved in the night. That last line was not Luwin's hand. It was a smear of black grease across the bottom margin. as if a man with filthy fingers had touched the parchment and the mark had insisted on being words. "Rams and men move doors," Roose Bolton said when Jon showed it to him. He didn't smile. "Ghost doors move on their own." "Do you believe in ghosts?" Jon asked. "I believe in doors," Roose said. The red spear in the sky faded day by careful day, and men were relieved and disappointed at once because the world looks more like itself when the heavens stop writing in blood. Ghost woke Jon 3 times in a week with a single low sound. Each time nothing came into the camp but the cold, laying its flat hand on men's faces. Each time news came on the next day. Ser Roderick had beaten Theon's men at the mill outside the winter town, and then turned to meet more men who had come from the Dreadfort with a boar's head pinned to their banner and a rough boy with pale eyes riding under it. The boar's head levered up and let him through the line, and when he opened his mouth he asked a thing politely and Ser Roderick answered politely, and then the boar's head men did something impolite and fast as a snake. Osha had taken Rickon by the arm in the dark and vanished with him and Shaggy Dog both, like rain down a crack. Lewin wrote Bran is safe 4 times, which is a way of saying he is not in the bed we think he is in, and he may be in the bed the world keeps for him when it cannot keep him anywhere else. Arya he did not write, because writing her would make her a hostage to words. When at last a letter came in a hand Jon didn't know and would have liked never to learn, it was a short thing. 2 small boys burned beyond knowing hard by the moat. The letter made a point of saying their faces had been pulp. The letter called them wolves. The letter spoke of duty to truth. Better men know the shape of their losses than be given good dreams. Lewin's letter the next day did not say these were Bran and Rickon. It said the faces could not be known. It said 2 boys in the miller's house were missing. It said 1 man was practicing his smile on a wall. Jon went out beyond the outer ring of pickets and stood in a field of grass with the stalks at his thighs whispering their own language. Ghost stood beside him, and the wolf's breath smoked in the morning. Jon reached down and took the fur into his fingers and pressed until his hand was warm like that instead of the fire running up his wrists. "I should be there," he said to the field and the wolf and the part of him that was still a boy at Winterfell. "I should go north and be at the gate before anyone else and make the choice that will cut or heal. I should not be here, fighting a war that seems to take any man it likes and leave others who should have gone. I should not be counting men who are not mine while my brothers." Ghost leaned against his knee like a wall. The pressure put Jon back into his body. He tasted iron and breath and the morning. He breathed, and the breath made a small sound in the grass. He put his head back and looked at the sky, and the sky looked back without any letters written there now. "I will be there when the road lets me," he said, and the words did not satisfy him and were all he had. He went back to the tent where men waited on words as if they were knives to be handed out. He took the maps and weighed their edges with his fingers. He stood at Robb's shoulder when his brother sent for men and sent men away. He went down into the horse lines after midnight and ran his hands down the legs of 3 geldings and 1 mare and found the swelling before a master of horse could. He sat beside Jaime Lannister in the iron cage beneath Riverrun's curtain wall and let the Kingslayer talk until the sun set so that Robb would not break a hand remembering what it felt like to be cheated by a friend. "They will not be dead," Jaime said, not unkindly, as if trouncing a squire who had just dropped a practiced sword. "The world kills our fathers properly, kills our brothers by inches, kills our sons with hopes, it kills our daughters by laying flowers on them and writing pretty, kills bastards by names and never knows it is doing it. But it doesn't burn the wrong boys when there's a purpose to be served by the right guesses. Takes a man like me to do that. Theon Greyjoy is not a man like me." Jon's jaw pulled tight. "Do you mean to comfort me with that? Do I look like comfort?" Jaime asked, delighted. "I mean only that you should remember what you are good at, Snow. You are good at seeing where the knife goes when it is in your hand. You are not good at imagining where it has gone when it is in someone else's. Trust the first. It will keep you from making the second into a tool for other men." "Do you love anyone?" Jon asked abruptly because the words would not be guessed away, and he had to put them between them to stop thinking of burned boys. "My sister," Jaime said, without the calculation Jon had come to expect. He smiled then, and it was an ugly thing and a true one. And a boy I threw out of a window. I loved him as he fell, which is another way of saying I loved how the world seems to be when you think you can decide how far down a fall goes. He leaned his head back against the bars and shut his eyes. I loved the man I was before I lifted my sword in the throne room and kept the world from becoming something worse than it is. We love our own lies best. Jon left him there in the dim with the sound of the river licking the stones. Ghost shook water from his coat outside as if the river's very talk had splashed them. He went to the place where Robb sat with his head in his hands and his crown set on the table beside him like a cuff taken off to show someone it fits. Jon touched his brother's shoulder, and Robb lifted his head and looked at him and did not have to speak. "We will go home," Jon said. "We will go home and take back our door with the knife that goes in the right place. We will make Theon Greyjoy learn that the ground is older than the sea." Robb's mouth opened and closed. "And then?" he asked quietly. "And then I go north," Jon said, finally naming the coin he had been holding under his tongue. "When you no longer need me for this road. When the wall writes its own letter on the air so loudly even men like Theon can hear it. When our house has a roof again and the hinges will hold. I will go north. I will stand where men stand when our fires go out." Robb let out a breath, and it sounded like a man setting a thing down that had been too heavy to be carried and yet had to be. "You will go north," he agreed. "And if I am alive when you do it, I will make the world understand that when a Stark's bastard takes the black, men should take off their hats first." "Not yet," Jon said, half a smile finding his mouth like an old friend who had been waylaid and had finally made his way through. "We have lions to teach manners." They went on. They harried and struck and pulled away, and each time left a little blood behind to find their path back by if they needed to. They moved men along the marsh paths by twos and threes and gathered stories from women who could carry a cow on their backs and from boys who did not yet know enough to lie, and they made those stories into maps that did not come close to being complete and were still better than what their enemies used. They sent letters into the dark, and some returned and some did not, and the men who had sent them slept and woke and did not ask after them because asking jinxes the path letters take through weather. And always, at the edge of hearing, a sound like horn on a high cold night when it is not fit for men to be out ran along Jon's bones and was gone. It made him think of a wall that is not a king's wall. It made him think of his father saying, "I did my duty in a room where there was not enough light," and of the way a dire wolf chooses where to put its feet when the river is in flood. He sharpened his knife. He counted the men who ate and the men who did not. He stood when Robb stood and sat when he was told to and slept when Ghost led him, and he kept the coal under his ribs alive and small, and he watched the road home, and he did not let his eyes lose the west or the north even when the sky told him nothing at all.